Welcome to the Leadership Lyceum, a CEO's virtual mentor. Now, here's your host, Tom Lindquist.
Glad to have you back in the Leadership Lyceum, where we bring you direct access to top CEOs and directors of boards in an interview format that provides insight on situational issues that confront CEOs every day. It is a CEO's virtual mentor. Welcome to episode 17. I joined Gordon Van Welie, President and Chief Executive Officer of ISO New England, on a clear late summer's day at his office just outside of Springfield, Massachusetts. The general population would likely not be aware of the pivotal and critical role that an independent system operator plays in the reliable delivery of electricity across large regions of the United States, moment by moment, 24/7. I'll be right back. I'm delighted to be here in Holyoke, Massachusetts with Gordon Van Welie, President and CEO of ISO New England. Thank you for hosting me today, Gordon.
And thank you for inviting me. I'm looking forward to the conversation.
ISO New England is an independent system operator that is responsible for the transmission of electricity across the six-state New England region that includes Connecticut, Maine, Massachusetts, New Hampshire, Rhode Island, and Vermont. The company's power system engineers, economists, computer scientists, and other professionals ensure that the region has reliable, competitively priced wholesale electricity today and into the future. Gordon hails from South Africa and spent the foundational years of his career in a variety of engineering roles with Eskom, South Africa's electric utility. He joined Siemens and served as vice president and general manager of their power systems control division, delivering IT solutions for electric companies. From Siemens, he joined ISO New England as COO in September of 2000, and shortly thereafter was promoted to CEO in May of 2001. Happy 18 years, Gordon.
Yes, thank you very much. It's hard to believe 18 years has gone by so quickly.
You've been involved and even presided over that time in significant change in the regional transmission development. Perhaps we can go back and lay the foundation by reassessing the origins of the ISO and back to electric industry restructuring. And why did it all begin in the first place?
There were two very powerful forces at play. If one looks at what was happening in many industries in the 70s and 80s, there was a big move towards introducing competition. The federal government was doing it. It was a topic of discussion amongst the states as well. But if you looked at the trucking industry and the railroad industry and the natural gas industry, telecommunications, airlines, all of this was moving along on a path towards greater and greater competition. Policymakers were saying, why can't we do this in the electric industry as well? So that thought was out there in a very generic way. The local regulators in New England, the policymakers in New England, were becoming disenchanted with the cost of service model that had existed up to that point in time. So they were asking themselves, there has to be a better way. And if you look at what the federal regulator was doing, the FERC, they were also systematically opening up the marketplace. By the time we got into the 1990s, FERC was already introducing some of the foundation for what would become the competitive wholesale markets, with defining open access to the transmission system.
This open access was provided through FERC orders 888 and 889. These orders also encouraged the creation of independent system operators, or ISOs, and regional transmission organizations, or RTOs. These entities now manage most of the power transfers across the country. FERC recognized the difficulty in ensuring non-discriminatory open access to the transmission system when single companies often own both electric generation and transmission facilities, and it saw ISOs as a way of interposing an independent grid manager that could avoid such conflicts.
FERC was setting the stage. New England was getting pushed along through its own desire to seek a more efficient system, and those really came together in the creation of ISO New England in 1997.
The industry needed something in the middle of all this, between the generators of electricity and the traditional electric utility companies that would distribute the electricity to customers like you and me. This function or entity was going to continue to operate the system in a non-discriminatory fashion and do the planning and ultimately the operation and administration of the markets.
That became ISO New England. So in 1997, when the ISO was created, it was of the order of about 130 employees. And 5 years later, it was close to where we are today, around 600 employee mark. And that's really because we ended up having to scale up our responsibilities, and the world became a lot more complicated from an administrative point of view. Prior to 97, all the wires and all of the generation were owned by utility companies in the region. Utilities, with their state regulators, had chosen to build certain generators. The question then on a daily basis was, how do you optimize the production of electricity from those generators that the region had decided to build? And so the act of requiring the utilities to sell off their generation then created several hundred, 300-400 generating units, which were now in a competitive market, and they were acquired by private investors. So I should also say that this was happening right across the country. So it wasn't unique to New England. The state regulators and the utilities are no longer making the decisions about what generation to build. It's the marketplace, and in the form of investors, that are deciding to take private capital and put it into the market in response to the perceived revenue streams in the market for different resource types. And I think what's really interesting, 20 years later, the states are starting to get back into the decision of what the resource mix should look like. The new policy question that has emerged, depending on where you are, but let's say in the last decade in particular, has been the swift move towards trying to decarbonize the electric system, particularly with the thought that this would be the stepping stone to decarbonize the economy as a whole. Because renewable resources are required in order to produce carbon-free electricity, the issue has been, how does one get these resources built from a policy point of view? Because for the most part, up until very recently, renewable resources have tended to be uneconomic in the context of the existing wholesale electricity markets. The states have gotten at that problem through a variety of different mechanisms. One has been the renewable portfolio standards. The other has been in terms of trying to put a price on carbon. There's a very modest price on carbon through the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative that exists in the Northeast. But the more recent phenomenon, which is quite prevalent now, is through long-term contracts for renewable resources. But you can see that a 20-year contract is a very different proposition to the kind of market that we run, where the most we're giving people is an annual commitment through a forward market.
We'll be right back with Gordon Van Welie, President and CEO of ISO New England. We're back with Gordon Van Welie, President and CEO of ISO New England. I see the ISO as being, by its very nature, by its position, by its role, is deeply intertwined with policy and politics. It can't be divorced or looked at separately from policy and politics. You face a varied tapestry in New England between federal, regional level policy direction and state by state. But let's take that tapestry apart and look at each one of those, because it seems like each of them play into what you face in terms of leadership of the ISO.
Sure, be happy to do that. So FERC, our regulator, and the ISO look at the world quite narrowly in a way. We're saying, let us design a market to achieve the most efficient procurement of the reliability services needed to keep the lights on. But the states are looking at it more broadly. They're saying, well, that's great. We want you to do that, ISO, but we also want to see that we make steady progress towards lowering carbon emissions. And then there's yet a third objective, which is the economic development objective, which exists in many states, which is to say we would like to, instead of sending our dollars out of state to some gas producer in Pennsylvania, what we'd rather do is to put up solar panels or wind turbines in our state, because in doing that, we're creating jobs locally in our state. That last objective is even more difficult to capture in the wholesale market construct than the environmental objective. FERC can only operate in terms of what they've been empowered to do under the Federal Power Act. And essentially what they've been empowered to do under the Federal Power Act is to regulate interstate commerce, interstate sales of electricity, wholesale electricity. And that gives them the platform to regulate the wholesale electricity markets. And to essentially, they are the governing body that has the ultimate say on what the wholesale market rules are. So everything we do here in this region, between us and our stakeholders, is about producing a proposal that will ultimately go to the federal regulator for approval. So nobody gets the final say here. Ultimately, the final say happens at the FERC, and even then, there's always the courts if people are dissatisfied with what the FERC comes up with. So the first thing to sort of reflect on is that there are limits to what the FERC can do. And the FERC is going to be focused on making sure that the markets that it regulates produce efficient economic outcomes through competition. And so, a huge amount of effort obviously goes into this, both from the regions and the FERC, to make sure that the market designs are effective in terms of meeting that reliability objective. But FERC really isn't authorized to deal with the environmental objective. That would require an act of Congress.
So two missions with FERC in this policy tapestry at the federal level. It's both the market and the robustness, the fairness of the market, and reliability as well.
So that's the focus today, and still is for both us and for the FERC. As the states seek to meet these other objectives that I've described, which is the environmental objectives, the carbon reduction objectives, and the job creation objectives, they're taking actions for other policy reasons that result in resources being built. And then one confronts the very natural question of, well, if we've now built a set of resources for reasons other than specifically reliability, but they actually can provide reliable service, shouldn't we take them into account in some way? Because you don't want to overbuild the system. From a societal point of view, it doesn't make any sense to build twice as much resource relative to the need. And so to be efficient, you want to build enough to keep the lights on. But yet there's a set of resources that have now come about through long-term contracts that are arguably above market. And as one then tries to take them into account in the wholesale market, one creates economic distortions. And in fact, the thing you might do is to unwind the economic incentive that caused the investment in the markets in the first place. So it's a real catch-22 in some ways. And if you look at what's been happening in all the RTOs that are trying to achieve resource adequacy through the market, it's become the huge topic over the last, I'd say, 18 to 24 months. It's probably worth mentioning that, not all of the RTOs are trying to achieve resource adequacy through the market. So if you were to take SPP or MISO, they're still really relying on the cost of service construct, where the states, in conjunction with their local utility companies, are making the decisions as to what resources should be built, and they then guarantee recovery of those investment decisions from ratepayers or customers in those regions.
Why are they able to do that in those regions? What's the distinction?
Because really the states never fully restructured. And so a lot of the generation, the majority of the generation in those regions, are still owned by the electric utilities. And you really just have a different FERC-regulated mechanism for optimizing the daily production. So prior to the establishment of these broader markets, many of these regions of the country did not have these tight power pool arrangements, which had arisen particularly in the Northeast after the blackouts in the 70s, late 60s and the 70s. So what FERC really allowed to be created was the optimization of daily energy production across much broader parts of the country. I think about 2/3 of the electrical output from generation in the US is now governed by these FERC wholesale electricity markets. But if you look at it with a higher level of resolution, you'll see that it's really New York, PJM, New England, and ERCOT that are trying to achieve resource adequacy through the market.
We'll be right back with Gordon Van Welie, President and CEO of ISO New England. We're back with Gordon Van Welie, President and CEO of ISO New England. Let's go back a little bit more specifically into the regional level versus the state level policy in New England and what you're seeing. Are the states in particular, the states across the region, the 6 states, aligned on policy, or do you find that there's distinctions at the state-by-state level that you're having to?
So from a similarity point of view, all of the New England states have similar goals in terms of achieving an 80% reduction in carbon emissions economy-wide by 2050. So that's sort of a common theme amongst the states. If you drop down a level below that, you'll notice quickly that 3 of the 6 states have got legislative mandates to do that, and 3 of them, it's still aspirational. So they've made policy statements, but they haven't hardwired the achievement of those policies into legislation yet. And so that's where you start getting a departure amongst the states as to how quickly one should advance and at what cost should one advance along this path towards decarbonization. Because just to take a step back for a moment, carbon reduction, 80% carbon reduction economy-wide means you've got to take carbon out of the electric sector and transportation and building sectors, which is really heating. And so the region has made reasonably good progress on the first. Carbon emissions are way down relative to where we started 20 years ago, but really have made no progress at all in the other 2 sectors. So it's really becoming critical, if the long-term goals are to be achieved within the next 25 years, that we start making progress in these other 2 sectors. And the logical thing to do is to leverage the electric industry, because it is the industry that offers the promise of low carbon energy to be supplied to these other sectors. So I think the debate then that I see playing out amongst the states is really with regard to the costs and the implications of the different levels of appetite in terms of cost, really. And we see that playing out in terms of all the various actions the ISO has been taking. And so in some ways it's easier if you're a single state ISO, New York or California, because there's one legislature, one governor to respond to. In a multi-state RTO, it's more difficult because you have multiple states and multiple actors, and they may not be aligned in the details. And that's the world that we live in.
Let's take another quick break. We'll be right back with Gordon Van Welie, President and CEO of ISO New England. Back to regional issues. One prominent issue seems to be operational risk. This risk appears to reveal itself in several areas. The risk of fuel supply and reliability, the operational risk associated with a changing generation resource mix, such as the intermittency of renewable resources. How much operational risk should the region assume?
As one can imagine, once you're in the world of risk and the probabilities associated with the different paths, it's a very complicated conversation. And one of the issues that's sort of driven this to the fore recently is this issue that we've been facing for many years now, which is the region is constrained in the wintertime as to how much fuel it can bring into the region, both gas and oil and so forth. If one is pursuing a decarbonization agenda, you've got to burn less gas and less oil and less coal. But how do we as a region ensure that there's enough energy in the system during the winter to make it through really cold weather periods without compromising reliability?
The operable concept for ISO New England is fuel security. Gordon expands on the concept.
We started off using the terminology fuel security because it really was an analog to transmission security in some ways. So I'll just use transmission security for a moment to illustrate the point. So when we run transmission studies to look to see whether we have enough transmission wire in the air to move the energy around when it's needed, we refer to that as transmission security. So it's really about having a reliable transmission system. The fuel security nomenclature arose because what we were trying to do was describe a similar need, which is If the generators are there to produce electricity to put onto the wires, there needs to be an infrastructure behind them that moves the fuel to them in a timely fashion. And this region has really been living on a natural gas infrastructure that was built to serve a demand that's much lower than it is today. So the folk who built and paid for the pipelines or the gas distribution companies, for many years, there was a very good symbiotic relationship between the folk who invested in those pipelines to serve their customers in the winter, and then the gas generators that got connected to our system. Because in the summertime, when we have a summer peak, the gas system's underutilized, so the gas generators can use that same underlying gas infrastructure to supply themselves with fuel to produce electricity. And as long as you've got enough margin on that infrastructure over the wintertime, everything works out just fine. But if what happens is the demand by the gas generators and the demand by gas customers collide in the winter, and so that's where the reliability concern in the wintertime emerges. And we label that fuel security. And so the question is there enough energy in the system from an electrical production point of view to maintain reliability?
Let's take a quick break. We'll be right back with Gordon Van Welie, President and CEO of ISO New England. The theme of our conversation is the transition to a clean energy future. Given the winter fuel security issues, there are constraints around instantaneously realizing our zero-carbon future in a reliable fashion. Is there a phased approach to our carbon-free future that assures power availability?
Well, I think the reality is that the fossil fuel that's really going to be the bridging fuel is going to be natural gas. To the extent we don't have enough of it in the system when we need it, we're going to rely on other fossil fuels like oil. There's not much coal left in New England, but the heavy oil is essentially New England's version of coal. We have some 5,000 megawatts of 40, 50-year-old steam units that in their operation look similar to coal units, but they're not burning coal, they're burning heavy oil. And they have a similar carbon content actually to coal. So the conundrum for the region is, how do we let those resources retire? How quickly can we let them retire? And so part of how we've become stuck is that one would normally want a market to work in a way that older, less efficient technologies get displaced by newer, more efficient technologies. So the easy analog there would be gas-fired combined cycles running off, $2-3 per million BTU gas from the Marcellus Shale can easily displace an old coal or oil unit. But for the fact that we don't have enough gas available to supply that unit in the wintertime.
It comes back to sufficient gas pipeline infrastructure to supply the needs of gas-fueled power generators.
So that combined cycle ends up having to either not run, or it switches to burning jet fuel, diesel fuel, which also has a fairly high carbon emission profile. In the long run, the hope is that you'd be able to do with less and less of this, because you can compare renewable energy sources up with electrical storage, which is now the new technology that's starting to emerge. But electric storage in the form of lithium ion, for example, is still a fairly costly technology, much more expensive than, let's say, a comparably situated gas generator burning gas. Mm-hmm. And so I think the shift, the displacement of these resources by storage is going to take a while. One of the dimensions of storage that's still problematic is how long can the storage operate before it needs to be recharged. And so typically a lot of these technologies that we're seeing have 2, 3, 4 hour discharge periods, and they're done, they need to be recharged again. And so until we can find a storage technology that's comparable to a big tank of gas or a pipeline that you can pretty much run without interruption for days and weeks on end, we're going to be stuck with this problem.
Mm-hmm. Back to the natural gas supply, describe the magnitude of the shortfall, especially in the winter months or the peak summer months.
Well, we put a lot of effort into trying to quantify that very question that you ask. So we felt the best way of answering that question would be to do some scenario analysis. We did this study, which we called the Operational Fuel Security Analysis. We released it in January, and we produced 23 different scenarios. And what was troubling about that analysis is that roughly 20 of the 23 showed some operational problems looking forward to the mid-2020s. And that caused us to sort of raise the alarm and say we're heading down the wrong trajectory here in New England. 3 of the scenarios showed a more optimistic outcome, but that required massive injections of renewable energy into the system at a speed that wasn't yet visible in terms of the state contracting. And so the huge debate in the region is how fast are we going to migrate towards these injections of renewable energy, and can we let some of the older stuff go before we even have certainty about the incoming renewable energy?
Gordon refers to letting go or retiring the old higher carbon emission profile but reliable technologies.
The equation solves when you can inject a lot of LNG into the system, because LNG really becomes the swing supply of fuel to be able to balance the system. So to come back to your question, the quantity, we really manifested it in terms of how often do we get into reserve shortage conditions, how often do we have load shedding, rolling blackouts, where we have to put people's lights out or require the transmission owners to do that.
We'll be right back with policy requirements to untie this Gordian knot. We're back with Gordon Van Welie, CEO of ISO New England. What can policymakers do to solve this regional puzzle?
So I think the big question for policymakers in the region is that the kind of system we want? Do we want to be exposed to that level of operational risk, or do we want to do something from an infrastructure point of view that hedges some of that risk? And that broader topic is also playing out in Washington, D.C. at a national level around this issue of resilience. The thing that makes the New England experience really interesting is we probably have the most extreme problem of every region in the country. The question really that it comes down to is, I've used this terminology before, where there's a race going on. There's a race in terms of a race to the exit for resources that are looking to retire because they can no longer make a living in the market. There's a race happening on the other side where the states are signing up for new sources of energy into the region. And the question really is, will these two things line up? We need them to line up in order to make reliability hold. The question is, how does one coordinate all of that? And we're trying to coordinate that through a market where we don't have direct authority over what investment decisions are made. We're doing it through a set of economic signals, which makes it really complicated. In the old world, you could actually go off and sign contracts, and you can decide, I'm going to let you go because I'm signing another contract to replace this other resource, and you can orchestrate it with a higher level of granularity. We're having to administer a market where, by definition, we're supposed to be the neutral market system operator, not favoring one resource or the other, but we're faced with having to make retirement decisions before the replacement resource has arrived. So it makes it really tricky for us.
You don't have a persuasion towards one resource or another.
No, exactly. We have a persuasion towards reliability and efficient markets for achieving the reliable outcome. But it's a very complicated stew of physics, engineering, software. Actually, if you want to think about what's behind the operation of the market and the system, law, what exactly does the Federal Power Act say and what doesn't it say, and from where do we derive our jurisdiction? Economics, making sure that all of this happens in the most economic fashion possible. And then with economics comes politics, because politics is often about economics. And so all of those things get blended together and make for a very interesting world that we live in. None of this would work were it not for the magnificent people we have here at the ISO. So if you look, all those topics that I just described to you, we have got a cadre of people behind the scenes working on the engineering and the physics and the software and the legal side of things, and economists that are thinking about how best to change the market to produce the most efficient outcomes. And so these folks are working night and day on this stuff, often under enormous pressure, because The world's not waiting for us to make up our mind. The world's happening around us. People are making decisions regardless of what we do. And we are running hard to stay abreast of it, or in some cases to catch up with where the world's already moved.
You're inspiring the young people coming up in terms of educating on this very complex mixture of expertise that's required in the ISO.
Gosh, we've got a very extensive program where we work with many of the local universities, but also a summer intern program, which is, we're very proud of it. It's fantastic in terms of the quality of the interns that we get. Big shout out to our HR department and the folk that work with Jan Dickstein, who's our VP of HR, and Laurel Hennebury, who's overseeing the outreach program to the universities. We realized that we were basically invisible, because who knew about the ISO? Right. This little organizations in Holyoke. And so we had to get out on site at the job fairs, the career fairs at the universities, reach out to the heads of departments of all the various universities. And I would say the other thing that helped us is that we're doing such interesting R&D work that many of the professors at some of these engineering universities wanted to work with us. What's really great about it is we're drawing people from all over the country. So this is not like we're just going to our local universities here. Of course, a large percentage of the interns do come from local universities, but we're drawing from all over the country, which is heartening to see. So we have several programs. The one is the summer intern program, which is a formal program, but we also end up doing discrete R&D projects with a whole range of different universities. We tend to try and have those be local in the region because there's more face time needed if you're embarking on a 1 or 2 year R&D project with somebody. So the combination of all of those activities got a general level of awareness. And then as we started cycling students through, they came here, they had a great experience, they told their friends, and so the whole program built. We have a limit from a budgetary point of view, but just to give you a sense, we have something like 3,000 people applying for ultimately about 30 positions on the summer intern program.
So after 18 years at the ISO, what would you say in terms of the young people coming in and coming up in the ISO?
Well, the thing I'm really pleased about is that people are taking an interest in this sector again, because it's an exciting sector for a change. So with all the changes, it's an easy sell now to say to people, this is an exciting sector. 20 years ago, it looked like a deadly boring sector because things hadn't changed much. It was sort of a stuffy industry with fairly static environment. But the changes that have occurred as a result of actually the introduction of competitive markets, the rate of change really picked up dramatically after the introduction of competitive markets. So just like competition stimulated the dramatic changes we see in the telecommunications industry, it so has stimulated technological advancement in the electric generation sector. And then, of course, overlay into that the policy imperative towards decarbonization. And so I think for young people who are in universities today looking at what field do I want to engage in, certainly the energy sector, the electric sector has become a whole lot more attractive than where it was. And we're seeing that in terms of the people coming in and seeking entrance into our intern program or anxious to work with us on various projects.
Thank you for hosting me today, Gordon.
Thank you. Thank you for allowing me to participate.
We hope you found this episode 17 featuring Gordon Van Welie informative and educational. Leadership Lyceum, a CEO's virtual mentor, has been a production of the Leadership Lyceum, LLC. Copyright 2018, all rights reserved. Come back and see us. It's lonely at the top.